Welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, which is a partnership between War on the Rocks and the University of Texas at Austin. I'm your host, Rick Landgraf. My guest today is Jeffrey Ding, author of Machine Failing: How Systems Acquisition and Software Development Flaws Contribute to Military Accidents. This article appears in Volume 8, Issue 1 of the journal, and this is the winter 2024-2025 issue. Jeff is an assistant professor of political science at George Washington University. He is also the author of Technology and the Rise of Great Powers, published by Princeton University Press in 2024. Jeff, in this article, you address the question, how does software contribute to the risk of military accidents? It's a fascinating topic. Welcome to the show, Jeff.
Hey, Rick. Thanks for having me.
Let's jump right into the discussion here. Jeff, can you please summarize the argument of your piece?
Yeah, so the piece tries to provide an explanation for how software systems contribute to military accidents. And it does so by looking at the process by which software is developed and acquired in these military systems. So there's been a lot of research that shows a lot of the issues in software development comes in those early stages where you're setting out the requirements and specifications for what the software needs to do. And that process gets really messy with the acquisition of military systems because most of these advanced military systems are outsourced to contractors to develop the system, to develop the software, and design the software. And so my argument is that when software is developed in this way, in what's often called a waterfall model, in which the military lays out these requirements, and then the contractors follow step by step in terms of implementing the requirements, all the way down to the last stages where you finally get the testing and evaluation stage. That linear sequential method makes it very, very difficult for military end users and operators to provide feedback on how they would like to work with the software to discover unexpected vulnerabilities. And it also limits the ability of developers to correct known vulnerabilities once those known vulnerabilities are discovered. And so that's the argument in a nutshell, which is that these limited feedback channels between the military end users and the contractors that develop the software, that creates a lot of human-machine interaction problems, such as unwieldy interface designs, which leads to more accident-prone military systems.
And can you help us visualize the waterfall model again? Why is it called this? Can you explain this a little bit?
The reason behind the name is water does not flow back up a waterfall. It only goes in one direction. And so in all these stages of the software acquisition and development process, it's difficult for the feedback from the end users, which only comes after the system has been tested and fielded. It's difficult for that feedback to make its way back up the waterfall, all the way to that initial software requirements phase. And so one of the examples I give in the article is that the Patriot system had some issues with the touchscreen apparatus. And this had been discovered in which the touchscreen was way too sensitive, and that resulted in all these mistakes and issues. But then John Hawley, who's at the Army Research Laboratory, he told me in an interview that by the time these issues were figured out, it was way too difficult to rework the initial system and reevaluate the initial software concept. That's the idea behind this waterfall process, is it's difficult for water to flow back up the waterfall. The alternative model or one of the alternative models is a more agile approach to software development, where there is much more of this interactive flow of information between the end users of the software and the developers. And so there's more of that rapid prototyping and early engagement with the operators.
Right. And you mentioned one of the 4 cases that you look at in this paper, that being the Patriot Air Defense System friendly fire incidents in 2003, a series of, I think, 3 separate incidents at the beginning of the U.S. invasion of Iraq. We'll get into that one and then the other case studies that you look at. But let's wind back a little bit here. What inspired you to write this piece in the first place?
A lot of my research interests are in how AI, artificial intelligence, will affect international politics. And so at the time that I started this piece, I was affiliated with the Center for the Governance of AI at University of Oxford. And I was interested in this emerging field of AI safety, where we were discovering all these problems with artificial intelligence systems in which the systems were not behaving according to the aims of the human designers. And so I was interested in exploring AI safety in the context of military systems. And so a lot of my research looks at what are technologies that are similar to AI. And so I've done research on electricity, past industrial revolutions, and how these old technologies that used to be emerging technologies shape the balance of power. And so I took that same approach to this article, which is to look at computer software as a basic reference class for artificial intelligence systems, and to ask how these software intensive military systems sometimes fail and contribute to military accidents. That was the initial motivation. In terms of how it fit in with the other literature and scholarship, another source of motivation and inspiration was Scott Sagan's Limits of Safety text, where he studied command and control issues in nuclear systems. And that was a seminal and formative work that looked at how these complex and tightly coupled technological systems made accidents inevitable. And so he tested that theory, which is known as normal accidents theory, against this other school of thought called high reliability organizations theory, which argues that accidents aren't inevitable if you can develop the right organizational culture and practices to manage them. And so he had tested those 2 schools of thought against each other in the context of command and control with the US nuclear arsenal. Another source of inspiration for me was to build on that literature and say, can we go beyond this question of are accidents inevitable or not in these systems, and more finely trace how certain technologies, such as software, how certain technologies contribute to these military accidents.
Right. And you explore these questions in this piece through a series of 4 case studies and doing a case study comparison among the 4. And we talked a little bit about the Patriot case study before, but there's 3 other ones that I think are really interesting. And I think our listeners want to hear more about these. And I want to go through each one of these one by one, starting with the first case that you introduced in the piece. And that's the USS Vincennes shootdown of the Iran Air Flight 655 in 1988. Can you tell us this story, please?
Yes. So, as you mentioned, this takes place in 1988 as the USS Vincennes is passing through the Strait of Hormuz within Iranian territorial waters. And at that time, it hears reports that there are Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps speedboats that are attacking neutral merchant ships. The key technology at play here is the Vincennes Aegis system, which is this combat information center that has automated functions to classify targets and then control firing. functions. And so on that day in 1988, the Vincennes misidentifies a civilian airliner as an Iranian military plane, and it fires missiles at Iran Air Flight 6555 and tragically kills all 290 civilians on board. And so that stands as one of the deadliest civilian airliner shootdowns in history. The process of studying this case is trying to ask, how did the software acquisition and development process contribute to this misidentification by the Vincennes crew? And so in that process, what I found was a lot of the issues with the Aegis could be traced back to the limited extent of feedback from military operators to the software contractors, the companies that built the system, which was the RCA Corporation. And specifically, one of the details here is that to calculate how the target's altitude was changing, the crew had to do that by hand, and there wasn't a rate of change indicator that would clearly state that the plane was ascending like a commercial plane rather than descending like a hostile military plane. And so I actually interviewed a systems engineer at RCA named Matt Jaff, who had advocated for the Aegis display to include this very rate of change indicator. And he described to me that there just was not an opportunity for designers and users to revise the initial software requirements once they had been established. And so the Aegis was developed with that waterfall model that we talked about earlier, and specifically stated the software requirements discussion happened for one meeting of a few hours. And then after that, it was very difficult to incorporate operator feedback to include functions like this rate of change indicator.
So there's limited opportunity for feedback from end users to the acquisition, the system developers. And I think this is a trend that you draw out in subsequent cases. Can you now talk about the Patriot friendly fire incidents? Describe that story for us.
Yeah, so now we're in 2003 during the Iraq War. And here, the U.S. Army's Patriot system, an air defense system, is involved with 3 friendly fire incidents. One involves shooting down a British Royal Air Force Tornado fighter bomber. The second involves the Patriot radar locking on to a U.S. Air Force F-16. And then the Air Force pilot destroys the Patriot battery in response. And then finally, a Patriot battery also shoots down a U.S. Navy FA-18C, killing the pilot on board. And a pretty stark statistic is that of the Patriots' engagements in the conflict, these friendly fire incidents made up 25% of those total engagements. And so as I was tracing how the software development practices contributed to these friendly fire incidents, one of the issues that came to the fore was the identification algorithms, and specifically the identification algorithm to mark out whether something was a friend or a foe. And these were very brittle and required the operators to intervene, deal with, try to manage all of the problems with identifying friends or foes. And again, one of the main problems, such as this idea that the Patriot's algorithm would mistake aircraft for anti-radiation missiles. Some of these problems had already been marked out during the operational testing phase, but they just had not been corrected. And the feedback from operators did not make it back up that waterfall so that the Patriot system could be revised and adjusted to mitigate accident risks.
Okay, now let's fast forward to the next case study. This is in 2017, the USS McCain collision of the Alnick MC.
Yeah, so this is the McCain collision in which a U.S. Navy destroyer unintentionally collides into an oil tanker off the coast of Singapore and Malaysia. And so the key technology system here is the integrated bridge and navigation system. The end result is that 10 US Navy sailors die, and it's the Navy's deadliest accident in the past 4 decades. With the integrated bridge and navigation system, here the design of this software system, specifically the touchscreen steering, and then also the fact that different parts of the ship had control over different propellers, what's called the thrust control system. These design flaws were so severe that operators of the McCain, the crew on the McCain, got used to just disabling the system's touchscreen and ignoring some of the fault notifications because the displays were really difficult to interpret. And so those actions by the operators to disable various functions of the system contributed to the collision. And when the Navy did its internal review, one of the number one points of feedback from operators was that they overwhelmingly prefer mechanical controls over these touchscreen systems. And so I think one of the key lessons learned from this case is that there should have been an opportunity to trial this advanced navigation system on smaller ships to get that extensive and continuous user feedback early on, and then scale up this type of system to larger and more complex ships like the destroyer. But the waterfall method of software development here prevented that type of iterative process from occurring.
And before we move on to a case that's a little bit fresher in people's minds, this is the Kessel Run software and the Afghanistan withdrawal in 2021. Before we talk about that, it just really begs the question, because you cover it in these 3 case studies very, very well, is this factor of the limited opportunity for feedback, limited chances for end users, operators to provide feedback to improve the process before it's fully developed. Why is this a defining trend in this waterfall system? Why does this happen?
I don't come up with a definitive answer about the deeper root cause of why some militaries adopt certain patterns of software acquisition, but I can lay out a few initial hypotheses. I think one of the most obvious reasons might be just that prime defense contractors like Raytheon and Northrop, the latter of which was the developer of the navigation system in the McCain case, these defense contractors have really strong ties with politicians and defense officials. They've also built up this accumulated reservoir of knowledge about how to develop software according to particular military requirements. And so they're reluctant to switch to a different type of software development process. So a very simple explanation is just that vested interests prevent the switch to more agile development processes. Because if you do transform this software development practice, that could allow other competitors to come in and steal away long-time contracts. I think another contributing factor is also on the part of the senior procurement officials themselves. Part of it is they've grown up with the waterfall method. It's all they've known how to do. And so the military's acquisition culture and existing organizational norms might not be that supportive of these more agile methods.
In your 4th case study, you look at Kessel Run software, Afghanistan withdrawal. This was back in 2021, and you offer the opportunities that an iterative approach can bring. Tell us this story now.
Yeah, so I do want to, at the top, just state the caveat, and we've actually discussed this offline as I was revising this piece for Texas National Security Review, just this caveat that this is a very different context than these other 3 scenarios, which are happening in combat settings in which the stakes are a little bit more elevated than this specific mission, which is an evacuation mission. But still, it is a really, really significant and complicated process in which the U.S. evacuates more than 120,000 people from Afghanistan. And the central piece of software here is the planning tool to allocate which missions are allowed to take off when and where they go to. And so this is developed by the Air Force's own software factory called Kessel Run. The really interesting aspect of this case is that it's an opportunity to see how a more agile system can allow for more engagement with operators and navigate around some safety risks. So one of the key details in this case was that the evacuation got so complex and the number of missions had increased so much that it had exceeded the boundaries of what the software was initially designed to accommodate. But Kessel Run was able to make these on-the-fly patches because of an agile approach to software development. They could implement technical fixes very early on, sometimes within the span of 12 hours, and dry run those changes with liaison officers who were on the ground. And they were in constant communication with end users to facilitate the evacuation process. And so I was able to interview Brian Beach-Kosky, who actually led the Kessel Run process during the evacuation. And this case is a little different than the other ones because it's able to show how iterative and agile software development practices can reduce the risk of mishaps in a really complicated mission.
Jeff, what kind of reaction have you gotten so far on this article?
I've been really surprised by the reaction. I thought that this would be a relatively niche topic, so that I wouldn't get too much feedback on it, but it's been really cool to see just how much of a platform TNSR has gained. I think one of the most gratifying pieces of reaction came from someone who was actually part of the technical team that had analyzed the Patriot fratricides. And so obviously this person couldn't share the classified parts of that investigation he was a part of. And so he knew a lot of things that I could only get at so much from as an outsider looking in without access to those classified investigations. I got a chance to have breakfast with him, and it was really gratifying to learn a little bit more about the details of the case. And I was happy that he said the facts that I had assembled about the Patriot case were broadly correct. But he was able to even dive a little bit more into the details of that case. And so I think it's really cool that the U.S. military, out of any military organization, is, I think, more open about these breakdowns and these failures. And that's how the U.S. can do better. It's very hard to study 4 cases like these in depth for any other military organization in the world because they're just not as open to discussing these flaws. And so it was really meaningful to me that in the feedback process to this piece, I saw how their organizations in the U.S. military are trying to do better on these fronts and trying to prevent future tragedies like the ones that I've studied from taking place.
Yeah, it must be very gratifying as a scholar getting that sort of feedback from someone on the inside who has access to classified information that obviously you don't have access to, and you're researching this topic in some respects without all the facts, and still knowing that you're getting the story right must be really gratifying professionally.
Yeah. And I think these accidents are always going to be a product of all these different factors. People looking at each of these cases can come away with different takeaways. So I don't know if there is ever going to be, this one exact story. I think what I'm trying to do with this article is show we oftentimes cast blame on the military crew and the military operators. And the U.S. military itself is an organization where it's like you step up and take responsibility and sort of you take that blame, and so there's almost like an honor in that. But I think what I wanted to show in this article is that we almost never blame the organizations that actually develop the software itself. And you look at all of these post-accident reports from the military and the Northrops, the Raytheons, the RCAs, they're never even mentioned. So that was another motivating factor for me in writing this article.
You're certainly shining a light on an under-examined topic and problem. Final question for you. What advice do you have for other scholars who are researching the topic of how software contributes to military accidents?
Right now, there's so much attention to artificial intelligence in warfare and this particular type of software based off of machine learning and deep learning. And that's really exciting that it's such a growing and emerging field where people are trying to project and analyze how increasingly autonomous and automated systems will change the future of warfare. For me, one of my takeaways from researching this space, and something I try to stress, is we should, on the one hand, do all that work to figure out what is novel about AI and all these new risks that it will bring. But we should, on the other hand, not forget that artificial intelligence might operate like older technologies, like basic software. And so to not forget the lessons we can learn from these older systems and these older long-standing problems, such as the software development processes and the acquisition processes, like the waterfall method. And so we shouldn't forget that some of these older problems and risks will still apply to these newer contexts, such as autonomous weapon systems.
Jeff, that's great advice. And I want to thank you so much for the discussion today. And thanks for being on Horns of a Dilemma.
Thanks for having me, Rick.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma. Do not forget to read the Texas National Security Review, which you can find at tnsr.org.